Well, good morning, everyone. It's 10:31. We'll go ahead and get started this morning. Thanks for joining us today to learn about some recent analysis that has been done by FTI concerning the levelized cost of entry for new resources located in the PJM region of the country. This analysis, along with other tools you're already likely very familiar with, try to provide information about the cost of entry for generating resources that can be a useful tool for providing information to policymakers about the cost of the policies they're debating and adopting at the state and federal level. The importance of the work that's being shared today is that we hope it will help provide a more accurate estimate of the actual cost of delivering 24/7 power, not merely the estimated cost for certain resources that don't account for the delivery of that around-the-clock power. This analysis is based on publicly available data inputs and is designed to provide a full view of the cost to deliver reliable 24/7 power. While the author of the report, Robert Kaineg, will go into the details, I want to be sure there isn't any confusion about what we believe that this analysis demonstrates. There are, of course, always a range of views about the inputs, and there are, of course, regional variations and issues that do not translate across a broader footprint. But because of those limits, or perhaps because of those limits, we believe this tool is one of several that can be helpful in informing policymakers about the true costs of policy choices. It's also important to note that the analysis that Robert did and will walk us through this morning isn't favoring any resource over another, nor is it taking a position on any state or federal policy or tax credit or any other specific policy in place. The analysis is instead focusing on addressing the actual cost to ensure delivery of power on a 24/7 basis and accounting for all the resources that would be needed to support a system where not all resources operate with the same performance characteristics. In short, we believe it's vital for policymakers to have all the information about the actual cost of resources that are needed to deliver on their policies. We believe this tool will be helpful in providing information that is lacking and can help policymakers make a better informed decision that will more accurately align aspirational policy goals with operational realities. With that, I'd like to turn the program over to Robert Kaineg to walk us through the results of his analysis, and we'll save time at the end to answer questions at the end of Robert's presentation. Robert, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Todd. Appreciate that introduction and everyone for joining today. As Todd indicated, my name is Robert Kaineg. I work with FTI Consulting, and we worked closely with EPSA on this study. I'll just be sharing my screen now, so you should be seeing the slides popping up. So as Todd mentioned, the purpose of this study was really to try and address some of the shortcomings in current benchmarks for new generation costs. So I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with the levelized cost of energy metric, which has been used by NREL, Lazard, others to compare the cost of new resources. This is a very valuable tool, and it does provide an important data point when considering the cost of new resources compared to one another. But LCOE, because it only looks at the unit in a vacuum, essentially implies that those units operate as standalone resources, whereas in real life, when a new unit is added to the system, the system needs to, it has an impact on the system that has costs, right? So the goal here was really to try and provide a more holistic benchmark that addresses all of the costs to the system for interconnecting a new resource, and then compare how these different costs, base unit, transmission, resource adequacy, and curtailment, would look in PJM in 2026 as a point of reference. So what we did here essentially was to estimate these four costs that are listed here on the slide. There are the base unit costs, which are what it goes into a traditional LCOE calculation. So that's capital cost, including construction, operating costs, and fuel cost. Then we incorporate transmission upgrade costs. So these are interconnection costs and the cost of other transmission upgrades needed to accommodate new units. Resource adequacy cost, which is the cost of maintaining system adequacy in all hours, which is, as Todd already alluded to, is the most important cost in the study. And then curtailment costs. So certainly as units get curtailed, they have to spread their costs over fewer megawatt hours, and as a result, their costs may be higher. As I mentioned at the top of the call, this study is really a sort of point in time estimate or calculation. So we're looking at select technologies in PJM in 2026. And so these estimates include regional specific costs for the PJM system, estimates of interconnection costs, again, on the PJM system, an assessment of how wind and solar are currently being curtailed on the PJM system, and then ensuring that we're accounting for all those costs in the comparison of new resources. So this slide really just summarizes some of the key assumptions or sources of assumptions that we used. And while I'll go into detail on all of these in subsequent slides, but I think it's good to have an overview of what we all relied on. So for base unit costs, we started from NREL's 2022 ATB, the moderate view, as the basis for the new unit costs. We then regionalized those costs using estimates from EIA's annual energy outlook. So essentially evaluating how the costs on the PJM system compared to the national average in EIA's study and applying those to NREL's costs. For resource adequacy costs, we relied on PJM's ELCC estimates for the 26-27 base residual auction for our ELCC units. So that would be wind, solar, storage. And then we looked at the latest PJM reliability study for EFORD ratings for thermal units, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But generally, we require all units to true up to their specified UCAP threshold, which we'll get to in a slide here. For interconnection costs, we relied on a Lawrence Berkeley National Lab study that was released in 2023 called Interconnection Cost Analysis in the PJM Territory. This includes estimates for capacity and energy service by different resource types over the last 10 or 15 years, although we focused on the last 5 years. And then for offshore wind units, we also include an estimate of the spur line transmission needed to connect the units to the onshore system from offshore, and that was taken from NREL's 2022 ATB. And then finally, for curtailment costs, we relied on PJM's estimates of curtailments on the system for both wind and solar. So as I indicated previously, we relied on 2 different sources for the base unit cost assumptions. So capital costs, VOM, FOM, were all taken from NREL's ATB. But in order to develop a PJM specific estimate, we use the cost multipliers from the 2023 annual energy outlook. So there are 4 different PJM regions in the NEMS model, which is what EIA uses. So essentially what we did was to average the cost by technology across those 4 regions and compare it to the national average cost, again, in the NEMS model. And then that became a multiplier, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide here, which was applied to the 2026 moderate view from NREL. So as you can see, generally speaking, the cost to build in PJM is higher than the national average across most technologies, with land-based wind being the exception here, which is a little bit less than the national average. One thing I'll note on this slide, because it'll come up again later when we review the LCOEs for the technologies, is there was a bit of a disconnect between natural gas combined cycle and natural gas combined cycle with CCS. So if you look at the table, you'll notice that according to EIA, the average cost of building a combined cycle in PJM is roughly 13% higher than the national average, but building a NGCC with CCS was only 3% higher than the national average. So again, this will come into play later when we're comparing the cost of the units, but it's something I wanted to note now. We applied ITC and PTC to each of the technologies. So essentially what we did was to review the model and choose the tax credit which provided the most benefit to each technology. So you can see how that was laid out here. So each of these bars that has a green outline is the pathway that we chose. So PTC used for solar, wind, and ITC used for offshore wind, battery, and nuclear small modular reactor. And that's just because these were seen as the most advantageous by each technology. So this is probably an area where we'll want to spend a little bit of time. I think this is probably the nub of the study here. But one of the things that we did to try and put all resources on an apples to apples basis was require each unit to true up to the size of its energy unit. So on the left-hand side, you see an example using hybrid solar. On the right-hand side, you see an example using a CT. So in both cases, we either apply the ELCC or the EFORD rating and then require the unit to purchase a resource adequacy product in order to make up the difference between its firm capacity calculated using ELCC and EFORD ratings and the nameplate capacity of the energy unit. So you can see on the left-hand side, for example, we're not requiring that the solar plus storage unit meet the size of the battery and the size of the solar unit. Rather, we only have to meet the size of the solar unit. And what we've done is we have costed the capacity true up at the cost of 4-hour energy storage. So essentially what the true up represents is if you had to fill the cup to get to ICAP for the energy resource, no matter what you are starting from, if you had to go out and procure some amount of energy storage to sort of make up the gap, that is the cost of the resource adequacy true up. And we'll see how that plays out here in a few slides. So this slide just shows the values that were used for each technology in the study. So for the ELCC units, we used the latest BRA values for 26-27, which is consistent with our study year. And on the right-hand side, we see the thermal EFORD ratings. This is based on the latest PJM reserve requirement study. I will note that, and this will come up again when we get to the end, that we're using PJM's current capacity construct for this study. And so the UCAP values that are shown here on the right-hand side are really for summer performance. But we do note that units operate differently in the winter and the summer. And so, these values could be quite a bit lower for gas units if you were looking at a winter view of EFORD. In terms of grid integration costs, as I mentioned, we relied on the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab study. This study evaluated all of the different interconnection requests over the system over the past since the year 2000. We tightened the window a bit to focus on requests that were completed between years 2017 and 2022. And what we're seeing on the chart on the right-hand side here is the average cost for capacity service by technology type, by study type. So basically, there are 3 sort of categories. Either the study is currently active, so the study is currently being studied, it's already been completed, or the unit is in service. So generally speaking, we tried to use the completed cost for all technologies, although we were not able to in every case. So first, there were no recent coal additions really in the study, so we had to go back further in time before 2017 to get an example of coal units and their interconnection costs. Separately, for certain resource types, we didn't have a lot of data for completed studies. So for example, for offshore wind and hybrid wind, we ended up relying on the active studies for estimating the interconnection cost. And then finally, on storage, which is not pictured here, there were no requests for capacity service for storage in this data set, at least over the 2017 to 2022 timeframe. But there were observations for energy service. So we ended up using that for storage, and that ended up coming in around $20. Finally, with respect to curtailments, we reviewed the historical curtailment data that has been published by PJM. Generally speaking, because the forecast is fairly or maybe near in the future, so 2026 is not very far away, we based our curtailment data off these historical data so that we don't expect a major increase in curtailments between now and 2026. And so that was the data that we relied upon there. And so when you put all those costs together, you end up with our analysis, which is seen on the slide here. I know this is kind of a busy slide, so I'll try to walk through it. So for each of the technologies in our study, you have the dark blue line, which is the base cost, right? That's the base unit cost that accounts for NREL's estimate of the technology cost in 2026, as well as EIA's regional multiplier for that technology. Then you have the resource adequacy true-up. This is a function of the ELCCs of the units and the cost of having to purchase additional resource adequacy services at the cost of a 4-hour battery. Then the gray bar is the grid connection cost. You can see that this is generally not a major driver for most technologies, although it can be quite significant for offshore wind. And that really has to do with that spur line transmission that we discussed earlier in the presentation. And then finally, for units that are intermittent, you can see that there are curtailment costs, which essentially are, if the unit is curtailed for some portion of the year, then you have to spread the overall cost of the unit across fewer megawatt hours. And so that's what we see there. Again, not a major driver because we're not expecting a lot of curtailments in this time frame. In terms of overall findings of the study, we think this is very interesting. So first, while traditional LCOEs tend to be lower for new intermittent renewables than for thermal units, and in particular natural gas combined cycles, when you look only at the LCOE, traditional LCOE metric, when you account for all the costs of connecting to the system, these units look less competitive, these units being intermittent renewable units. And that's simply because of the low ELCC ratings that are awarded to these technologies from PJM. And in fact, what we see is that the resource adequacy component of the overall cost can be more than double the traditional LCOE for these technologies. And keeping in mind that land-based wind, for example, in the latest ELCC ratings has a rating of 13%, right? So there's quite a bit of true-up that's needed, and that's why you end up with these large gaps. Some other interesting things that we found were that even at the lower ELCC ratings that are awarded to 4-hour battery storage, these units look competitive with natural gas combustion turbines on an LCOE full cycle LCOE basis. Also, nuclear SMR units actually look quite good relative to other non-emitting generating sources when you take this view. So certainly not the most competitive technology out there, but much more middle of the pack when you account for all all categories of resource cost and not only the levelized cost of energy. And then finally, as I alluded to earlier, the current approach that we've taken here awards UCAP based on summer capability. And if you were to take a winter view, these numbers could look very different, right? So generally speaking, our gas units would tend to do worse, and they would have a much higher resource adequacy cost than we see here. And some of our other units actually would do better. So land-based wind, for example, tends to perform better in the winter than the summer. So this is just one view, and as PJM moves into a seasonal capacity construct, this view could change. Separately, we also looked at these technologies with no tax credits. Now, I want to be clear here that we're not against tax credits, or nor are we saying that tax credits aren't real. We are just providing another point of comparison for the study. So, we recognize that all technologies are subsidized to one degree or another, and we're not making a judgment on that. This is just this analysis is just information, to help policymakers and stakeholders. But generally speaking, what we see that without federal tax credits, new renewable resources and 4-hour battery storage tend to be less competitive than they were with tax credits, which is probably no surprise. And then separately, the tax credits are really critical to making CCS-equipped units economical, even at the lower technology costs assumed by NREL. So as we were, going through this study, one of the pieces of feedback that we got was that NREL's assumptions about carbon capture and storage technology were lower, less costly than the experience of some of our reviewers. But we were not trying to put our thumb on the scale here. We are only trying to reflect the analysis, as it comes out using publicly available data. So with that, I see that we have a few questions. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen here, and we can go back to the slides as needed. But Todd, I understand we may have a few questions from the chat.
Thanks, Robert. We do. And apologies for that horrible visual if anyone's stuck with that light over my head. So I've got one that has been asked a couple of ways. So I'll ask it broadly and then you can drill down and hopefully that'll answer it. But can you talk more about the resource adequacy costs and why those are important, or what's the significance of resource adequacy costs and true up in your analysis?
Yeah, certainly. So resource adequacy ensures that there is enough generation available to balance supply and demand across all hours of the year. And so these services are critical to providing reliable energy around the clock. So what we've done in our study is to evaluate the cost of providing that service, assuming that new generators need to procure a capacity product priced at the cost of new 4-hour battery storage units. So we do think this is an important consideration because certainly there are many benefits to non-emitting generating sources like wind and solar, but they don't provide energy all hours when customers need them. And so that's a reality that grid operators just need to face head on.
And I think the second half of that was around the significance of the true up. So you may have touched on it, but you may want to expound a little bit about why the true up was such an important part of that resource adequacy calculation that you were doing.
Well, yeah, it's just because thank you for clarifying. So yeah, the resource adequacy component tended to be the largest additional cost in our study simply because many of the units were awarded very little capacity credit in one form or another, whether it was through E4 rating or for ELCC. And so because PJM is purporting or planning to award them low ELCCs, then it requires quite a bit of capacity true up to make those units whole.
I hope that's helpful. One question that is, I think, kind of at base really important. Why does a full cycle analysis matter? I mean, if you're looking at the analysis, why should that be an important thing for consideration for somebody that's looking at the analysis that's been done?
Well, it's because individual electric generators don't operate in a vacuum. So it's not like we can just plug in a new plant. It has to be on its own, right? It has to be part of the broader system. And so that was really the goal of this study, was to provide a sort of apples to apples metric that allows comparison of different resource types that they all had to provide the same level of service.
We just had a question come in that I'll hope I get it right. So I'll try, maybe I'll just read it. That would make it easier to make sure that I get it accurately. How did you land on the 4-hour duration to calculate true-up costs? Lazard shows a 4-hour duration cost almost exactly 4 times what 1 hour costs. So it seems the final result might be sensitive or highly sensitive to what the duration of the storage that you picked. Is that clear?
Yes. So thank you for that question. So we selected 4-hour storage. It was frankly as a study assumption. I think there were different assumptions you could have taken. So we could have chosen 6-hour, 8-hour, and in fact, 4-hour battery storage doesn't receive a full 100% ELCC. So one could argue that choosing a longer duration storage might be a better choice. However, we didn't want to overly penalize the units for the resource adequacy costs. We thought 4 hours was a good benchmark that people would understand. But it is certainly not the only capacity resource that you could have chosen. I mean, we could have used a CT, we could have used longer duration storage, but it was the decision that we made for the study.
Great, fair enough. Another question, and one that expect, is often asked, but does this analysis adequately represent the impact of fossil fuels to or on the environment?
No. So, the purpose of this study was not to look at every single cost that could be ascribed to a generating unit. Rather, we were focused on the costs that would be incurred by the system to incorporate these units. So I think it is fair to point out that CO2 prices are not included as part of this analysis.
I've kind of got two questions, which I think kind of roll pretty closely together. So I'll wed them, and you'll do your best to try to sort through how I'm trying to ask them. But can the data that has been created by this study undercut renewables growth, or could it be used to undercut renewables? Or asked another way, is this just an attack on intermittent wind and solar resources?
No, absolutely not. So the goal of this study is not to advocate for any type of specific generation or to attack any types of generation. We're simply trying to put all of the different generating technologies on a level playing field for the purpose of providing all of the services that the system will require. So, we are certainly not out to make a case for or against any technology.
Thanks. I think that's important. One question that I think comes to mind, and we want to make sure that, listeners are clear about, does this analysis apply to the whole country?
So the way that it has been developed, it only applies to PJM. We use PJM specific ELCC values, technology costs, fuel costs, which I should have mentioned earlier. However, so the short answer is no. With that said, I think the same type of analysis could be performed in different RTOs in different regions to see the impact.
Thanks. I think that's helpful context as well. I'm looking in the Q&A box and I don't see any open questions. So Christina, I don't know if there are any other questions that are out there for us to cover that I may have missed.
I'm not seeing any at the moment. So folks, if you do have any questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A.
Give everyone a chance to type. I know it takes a second to.
Exactly. We'll give folks a minute or two, and Robert, you may get out without too many questions. We'll have to see. I guess while we're waiting for any questions that come in, were there any results that surprised you as you were building your model and working through the analysis using the inputs? I mean, there's literally hundreds of inputs that are included in this in order to calculate the results. Was there anything that you saw that came as a result of the calculations that was a surprise to you?
Yes, actually, I wasn't really expecting batteries to look as competitive with combustion turbines as they did at the end of the day. That was a surprise to me because usually when we think about cost of new entry, when we think about a lot of different markets, it's a CT that is considered to be that sort of marginal unit. So I was surprised to see that.
All right. As expected, the pause has given us an opportunity to get a couple of questions in. If you're looking at a region without resource adequacy, how do you compare intermittent resources to thermal resources?
So I guess you mean potentially a market without a resource adequacy construct. I think even ERCOT requires, I mean, at the end of the day, they have to keep the lights on, although they don't always do that. But certainly in a market that didn't value resource adequacy, you wouldn't have those costs. But I don't know that such a market exists. I think that all customers want to have power available 24/7.
Okay, and if I ask that poorly, our questioner can send a revised question and I'll try to ask it more accurately. One of the other questions was, I assume the answer is yes, but could this be expanded to other RTOs, and will you expand the analysis to other RTOs?
Certainly, it could be expanded to other RTOs. Whether it gets expanded to other RTOs, I think, is an open question at this point, but yeah, it could be done.
I assume there's a cost associated with such analysis, and therefore that is one of the issues, of course, to be addressed. Another question from one of our attendees: what impact would this have on entry in capacity markets if the results were incorporated by PJM?
I'm afraid I'm not certain that I understand the question. Perhaps you can try rephrasing it.
I did my level best to
Yeah.
read it just as it was submitted, so I'm not sure I can do better, but if the questioner
Maybe
wants
if the
to,
questioner doesn't mind taking one more crack.
yeah, if they want to resubmit it, I'd be happy to ask it again if it were rephrased in a way that maybe I could do a better job at translating. So my apologies for my lack of translation skills. And there is a question about sharing slides and assumptions, and I know that when this program is over, we're going to release some additional information that would be kind of the information that was included in the slides and some of the key takeaways that would be there as well. And Robert, I'm sure you're available for follow-ups if people have questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Happy to answer any further questions.
And I don't see yet any rephrased questions, so we'll give folks another minute or so. And then if we get those questions back in, we'll try to give them a second crack. And if not, then we can wrap this up and let you get on with your day. And I'm sure folks will have questions once they see the analysis and data that's provided. Okay. I have a question that is not a rephrase, but is a new one. So will PJM's proposed capacity market reforms have a significant impact on the conclusions of your analysis?
Yes. So we did briefly look at some of what the cost would look like if the winter capacity ratings that have been studied by PJM were to be used.
Mm-hmm.
And they do have a material impact on costs, as I mentioned. So for one, wind, particularly land-based wind, looks significantly better when you account for winter capability. And thermal units, natural gas combustion turbines in particular, tend to look a little bit worse under a view that incorporates winter performance. So certainly there are different cuts at this that you could take. So yeah, I think capacity market reform would impact these results.
Great. All right, I will hold it open for another minute. I don't see any rephrased questions or anything new in the queue. Christine, I don't think I'm missing anything, but I'll make sure that you're keeping me honest on that there's nothing out there that I've missed.
We have no open questions at the moment.
All right, well, Robert, I certainly want to thank you for the work that you did and the analysis and the helpful information that I hope policymakers will be able to take and utilize in a way that's helpful. It's clear that there is a lot happening in the energy space, and I think more information rather than less will help policymakers make a better decision. And hopefully this will be an input that people will be able to utilize to make some good decisions as they think about policies going forward.
Thank you for the opportunity, Todd. It was great speaking with everyone today. And as you mentioned, I'm more than happy to field questions after the call if people think of new ones. So
very good. Thank you, Robert. And thanks everybody for attending. Seeing no new questions, we will go ahead and wrap this up. And thank you for your attendance. Wish everybody happy holidays. And as Robert said, if there are follow-up questions, we're happy to put you in touch and make that connection. So thanks, everybody. Have a great week.